What happens to the Buddhist path when the Buddha himself tells you that he hasn't actually taught you a single absolute truth? I mean, welcome to the void. We are diving into a philosophical landscape where the ground you are standing on is, well, it's made of the exact same empty space as the sky above you.
It is a terrifying proposition, honestly. If every concept, every teaching, and every meditation technique is just a raft designed to help you cross a river, what happens when you suddenly realize the river, the shore, and the raft are all just entirely devoid of any inherent substance?
Right.
Most practitioners just cling to the raft. They turn the raft into a new religion.
Which is the terrifying, exhilarating ground zero of Nāgārjuna's 70 verses on Śūnyatā, the Śūnyatāsaptati. And just to be clear right up front, since you are seasoned Madhyamaka practitioners joining us for this deep dive today, we were skipping the 101.
Exactly.
We aren't going to spend an hour defining dependent origination, setting up the tetralemma, or explaining the basic emptiness of a wooden table. We're going straight into the architecture of this specific text.
We're looking at the blueprint today. The goal here is to provide a really comprehensive, high-level map of the global themes that make the Śūnyatāsaptati so completely unique. And we want to do this before we ever attempt to get into the granular verse-by-verse analysis.
Yeah, we'll save that for later.
Right, because this text offers a radical reframing of how we interact with reality. It pushes us way past just a mere intellectual understanding of emptiness into what we call the union of the two truths.
Let's start right there, actually, because the foundational lens here isn't just pointing out that conventional reality and ultimate reality exist alongside each other. It pushes us into the union of the two truths regarding all phenomena.
It does.
The text systematically applies this union to literally every set of opposites we build our universe out of. So samsara and nirvana, cause and effect, subject and object.
Yeah, Nāgārjuna demands that we see these opposites as existing in a union. They are never identical, they are never completely different, they are not both, and they are not neither. The conventional mind always wants to put things in boxes, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Like, box A is samsara, box B is nirvana. Nāgārjuna just burns the boxes. But where the Śūnyatāsaptati truly elevates the discourse is how it applies this logic to the two truths themselves. It establishes the union of the two truths about the two truths.
Wait, hold on. I need to wrap my head around that. The union of the two truths about the two truths.
Yes.
So if conventional reality is the way things appear, and ultimate reality is their emptiness of inherent existence, applying the union to them means they are mutually dependent. Conventional truth and ultimate truth co-define each other.
Exactly. And consider how easily practitioners fall into a hierarchical trap here. We spend years deconstructing our conventional reality, analyzing the aggregates, meditating on the lack of a solid self.
Doing the work.
Right, doing the rigorous work. But through that work, we start to elevate emptiness. We start treating conventional truth as this messy, illusory, lesser reality, while ultimate truth emptiness becomes the pristine, superior, real deal. We essentially turn emptiness into the absolute.
We make it a golden calf. We rip down the idol of the inherent self, only to build a new idol called emptiness.
Exactly. And when we do that, we are completely violating the core tenet of Madhyamaka. The Śūnyatāsaptati just obliterates that hierarchy. Conventional truth and ultimate truth are entirely equal. I mean, emptiness needs a subject to be empty of.
Right.
If there were no dependently originated phenomena, no tables, no thoughts, no karmic cycles, emptiness just couldn't exist.
So the two truths lean on each other like two sheaves of reeds. If you pull one away, the other completely collapses. Which leads us to a massive, really difficult realization that surfaces in the notes for this deep dive. Emptiness itself is not the ultimate reality.
Yeah, it's a bitter pill for the intellectual mind.
Yep.
We want a final destination, but you cannot just plant a flag in emptiness and declare victory. Emptiness is dependently co-arisen. Because it depends on phenomena to exist, emptiness is itself empty. It is just a conceptual tool, a phenomenal medicine.
So if emptiness is just a tool, what is the actual ultimate reality? What is left when the medicine has cured the disease and you throw the bottle away?
In the context of this text, we refer to tahata suchness, or reality as it actually is. And the defining characteristic of takata is that it is entirely inconceivable for our dualistic conceptual minds.
So we can't even think about it.
No, the moment you try to conceptualize suchness, the moment you try to put a name to it or visualize it, you have dropped right back into conventional truth. You are just holding another tool.
So we have to abandon our usual metaphors entirely. I mean, we can't even use the old map and territory idea because even the concept of a territory implies a solid ground we can eventually walk on.
Right, it implies a foundation.
And we're dealing with an architecture where the very concept of ground is a provisional designation. How does Nāgārjuna keep us from immediately reifying the concept of suchness? Or, reifying emptiness?
He does it by refusing to stay in the realm of abstract nouns. To prevent us from turning emptiness into a dogma, he aggressively deconstructs the mechanics of how any concept, any action, or any phenomenon supposedly functions. In the first major thematic movement of the text, the first 14 verses, he dismantles the most sacred map in Buddhism.
The 12 links of dependent origination.
Exactly.
He goes straight for the engine of samsara. The 12 links outline how ignorance leads to mental formations, which leads to consciousness, all the way down to birth, aging, and death. It's literally the step-by-step schematic of suffering.
And he examines the junctions between those links. He asks a very simple but devastating question. How does one link actually produce the next? To answer this, he utilizes the union of the three spheres of any relation or action.
Okay.
So if we look at causality, the three spheres are the cause, the action of causality, and the effect.
And the text demonstrates that a cause and its effect cannot exist in the three times. I want to unpack the mechanics of this, because it's where the intellect usually just short circuits. If a cause and an effect are simultaneous, causality is destroyed.
Let's trace the logic on that. If the cause and the effect arise at the exact same moment, they are effectively identical in their temporal existence. To use an analogy, it would be like a mother and a daughter being born in the exact same millisecond.
Which is impossible.
Right. The relationship of producer and produced requires a directional flow. Simultaneous existence obliterates that flow. The mother cannot give birth to the daughter if they arrive simultaneously.
But if they are separate, like if they are sequential, which is how we naturally experience time, we run into an even bigger problem. If the cause must cease before the effect can arise, we have a gap.
A total discontinuity of existence. If the seed is completely destroyed, completely non-existent, before the sprout arises, how does the non-existent seed transfer its energy, its seedness, to the sprout?
It can't.
Exactly. The dead ashes of a cause cannot reach across a void of non-existence to spark an effect. Nothing cannot produce something.
So simultaneous causality is redundant, and sequential causality is a magical leap across a void. Every single link in the 12 links of dependent origination faces this impossible hurdle. They do not snap together like solid puzzle pieces.
Because every single link is dependently co-arisen, completely empty of any inherent essence that could be transferred. The continuity we perceive is a conventional illusion.
This brings up one of the most jarring insights from our source material, the realization that, philosophically speaking, you are not a verb masquerading as a noun.
Yes. That is a crucial shift in perspective.
Yeah.
Many advanced practitioners reach a point where they successfully abandon the noun. They accept that the inherent self, the static, unchanging me, is an illusion. They stop believing in the noun.
Yeah.
But to avoid the terror of nihilism, they desperately grab onto the verb.
We trade ontology for process philosophy. We say, okay, there is no solid me, but there is a flow of consciousness. There is the unfolding of my karma. There is a process of becoming.
Right, we try to find comfort in the river.
We think that as long as things are moving, changing, and acting, there is some form of ultimate reality to hold on to. We reify the action.
But the triad analysis, the union of the three spheres, shatters the river. Nāgārjuna proves that verbs, actions, processes, and relations are just as empty as the nouns they connect. There is no real, inherently existent process of origination. There is no real duration. There is no real cessation.
Let's really break that down. Origination, duration, and cessation. The beginning, middle, and end of any action.
Think about the action of walking. For walking to inherently exist as an action, it must have a distinct beginning, a middle phase where the walking endures, and an end where the walking ceases. But where is the boundary?
Right.
If the origination of walking inherently exists, it must be separate from the duration of walking. But if origination is separate from duration, then things originate but never endure.
Oh, wow. And if duration is separate from cessation, things endure forever and never stop. You can't find the exact microscopic boundary where origination ends and duration begins, because to find a boundary, you need two solid, inherently existent things bumping up against each other.
Exactly. The verbs fall apart under analysis just as quickly as the nouns. The action of causing is just as much of a conventional phantom as the cause itself. They are mere designations, concepts we project onto dependently arising realities so we can function in the world.
Well, if the nouns are empty and the verbs are empty, if there is no real origination, no real duration, and no real cessation, we hit the classic panic button. the panic of the opponent.
Oh, the terror of nihilism. The opponent in these texts isn't just a rhetorical straw man. The opponent represents the deeply ingrained evolutionary panic of our own grasping minds.
The opponent looks at this framework and screams, if nothing is actually happening, if nothing inherently originates or ceases, you have destroyed the world. You've destroyed the Buddha's teachings.
Right, that's the natural reaction.
I mean, if karma doesn't inherently originate, then what stops me from harming others? Moral actions lose their weight. If suffering doesn't inherently exist, then the Four Noble Truths are a lie, and there is no path to liberation.
The opponent truly believes that emptiness is an acid that dissolves meaning, ethics, and physics. But in the second major movement of the Śūnyatāsaptati, encompassing verses 15 through 26, Nāgārjuna flips the entire paradigm. He doesn't just defend emptiness, he goes on the offensive.
Oh, I love this part.
He demonstrates that it is actually inherent existence, the very thing the opponent is desperately trying to protect that would destroy the universe.
Because inherent existence, Savava, means something exists independently under its own power, unchangeable and absolute.
Think about it. If a seed had the inherent existence of a seed, it would be eternally, absolutely a seed. It could never endure the change required to become a sprout. If suffering were inherently real, it could never be alleviated. You would be permanently locked in a state of suffering.
So if an unenlightened person had an inherently existent unenlightened nature, the path to Buddhahood would be mathematically impossible. Emptiness isn't the acid that destroys the universe. It is the open space that allows the universe to breathe.
Exactly. Emptiness is the very engine of possibility. It is the prerequisite for change, for evolution, for karma, and for liberation. The opponent's fundamental error is experiencing the two truths as mutually exclusive forces at war with each other. They think ultimate truth cancels out conventional truth.
They think seeing the emptiness of the table makes your coffee cup fall through to the floor.
But the union of the two truths means one truth implies and energizes the other. A phenomenon can only dependently arise, can only function in the conventional world, precisely because it is empty of inherent essence. And because it is empty, it is capable of dependent origination. They are identical in extension.
So Nāgārjuna successfully defends the conventional world. He saves karma and he saves the path. But the opponent isn't done. The opponent finds a perceived flaw in this logic and asks a question that strikes at the very heart of the Buddhist goal.
Yes.
This is the ultimate trap. If there is no real cessation of anything, because cessation requires a real inherent thing to actually stop existing, what is nirvāt?
It is a devastatingly brilliant question. The opponent says, you just proved that nothing truly arises and nothing truly ceases. Fine. But the entire early Buddhist model defines nirvāt as a cessation.
Right.
The cessation of craving, the cessation of the aggregates, the blowing out of the candle. If nothing arises or ceases, to the cessation of what does nirvāt do?
How do you blow out a candle that never inherently burned?
This is where the Śūnyatāsaptati forces a profound extrapolation of soteriology. Nirvāt, in this framework, cannot be about ceasing, rejecting, or destroying anything in absolute terms. You cannot destroy your defilements or your cravings because they never possessed inherent reality to begin with. You cannot annihilate the five aggregates.
But the traditional view of nirvāt feels like an escape hatch. You stop the wheel of samsara, you get off the ride, and you enter some unconditioned, peaceful state far away from the suffering of the world.
That dualistic model is completely dismantled here. If nirvana was a separate, unconditioned state that you entered after leaving samsara, that new state would be an inherently existent phenomenon. You would just be trading one absolute reality for another.
Yeah.
You aren't creating a shiny new enlightenment to replace a dirty old samsara. Any newly created state would be dependently originated and therefore empty.
So if nirvana isn't destroying the bad, and it isn't creating the good, what is left? I mean, what actually happens to a practitioner who achieves this?
Nirvana is the direct perception, the unmediated realization of the true nature of samsara right here and right now. It is the lived experience of the union of the two truths.
So you are seeing the conventional functioning of the world, the gravity, the traffic, the karma, the emotional weather of the people around you, while simultaneously directly experiencing its complete emptiness of inherent existence.
Because everything is empty, there is nothing to accept and nothing to reject in absolute terms. You don't flee samsara to find nirvana. You realize nirvana within the very fabric of samsara by recognizing its empty nature.
Okay, think of a lucid dream. When you are lost in a nightmare, the monster chasing you feels absolutely inherently real. You suffer, you run, you try to fight the monster, or you try to wake up to escape it. You want to destroy the threat or flee to safety.
The classic dualistic response of acceptation and rejection.
But the moment you become lucid, the moment you realize you are dreaming, the entire paradigm shifts. You don't have to kill the monster. You don't have to force yourself awake. The monster is still there, conventionally functioning within the rules of the dream, but your absolute terror evaporates.
Right.
You see the monster, but you also see the emptiness of the monster. The nightmare becomes a playground.
The lucid dream analogy is incredibly precise for what Nāgārjuna is mapping here. You don't reject the dream, you stop being conditioned by it. And this transitions us naturally into the third major movement of the text, spanning verses 27 to 55, where Nāgārjuna takes this realization of the lucid dream and systematically applies it to the very fabric of our waking experience.
The emptiness of triads. He really rolls up his sleeves and applies the union of the two truths and the union of the three spheres to the granular mechanics of how we interface with reality. He targets the mark, the marking, and the marked. He analyzes the past, the present, and the future, the conditioned and the unconditioned. He basically dissects the mechanics of perception itself.
He deconstructs the user interface of human consciousness. When we perceive the world, we assume a concrete triad is operating. There is my eye, the sense faculty. There is the tree, the object. And there is my visual awareness of the tree consciousness. We instinctively feel these are three distinct, independent entities that happen to collide in space and time.
I am an independent subject, walking through a world of independent objects, and my consciousness is just a camera recording the collisions.
But the triad analysis proves they only arise in mutual dependence. An eye cannot be defined as a seeing faculty unless there is an object to be seen and consciousness to register it. A tree is only a visual object in relation to an eye that sees it.
They co-create each other?
Conventionally, yes. None of the three components possess an independent, inherent essence that exists prior to their interaction.
Like three sticks leaning against each other, holding each other up. If you pull one stick away, the other two fall flat.
Yeah.
There's no central pillar.
And if perception itself lacks a central pillar, what happens to the actions we take based on those perceptions? This is where the text dives deeply into the mechanics of karma. Karma is the sticky web that holds the illusion of samsara together.
And the opponent rushes right back in here. If the triad of perception is empty, and the triad of karma, the producer, the action, and the result is empty, then karma must be a lie. You can't have an empty person performing an empty action to receive an empty punishment. It's a house of cards.
Nāgārjuna agrees that it is a house of cards. But a house of cards still casts a shadow. He argues that because the three spheres of karma are empty, karma functions exactly like an illusion. The text describes it as there, yet not there. It functions conventionally, but it possesses no ultimate core.
Which brings us to a mechanical question that practitioners wrestle with for decades. If karma is just an illusion, there yet not there, how do we actually stop it? How does the realization of emptiness put the brakes on a karmic cycle that has been spinning for countless lifetimes?
We have to look at the fuel source of the engine. Karma is driven by intention. Intention is fueled by our emotional reactions, attachment to things we like, aversion to things we hate, and those emotional reactions are entirely rooted in ignorance.
But ignorance here isn't just a lack of data. It's not that we didn't read enough books.
No, ignorance in this specific philosophical context is defined as the cognitive reflex of apprehending inherent existence. It is the ingrained habit of believing the action, the object, and the self performing the action are solid, independent realities. You only generate karma if you believe the triad is real.
So if I believe the gold coin is inherently valuable, and I believe myself inherently lacks it, I generate the karma of greed. I steal the coin.
But if you achieve the direct, non-conceptual realization that the entire triad is empty, if you see the gold, the self, and the act of stealing as completely devoid of inherent existence, like the monster in the lucid dream, the mind simply cannot grasp at them. You cannot generate ultimate attachment to a mirage once you deeply, truly know it is a mirage.
The thirst just vanishes. You don't have to actively suppress the desire to drink the mirage water. The desire itself fails to arise because the cognitive error that created it has been corrected.
Exactly. Without that grasping, the engine of karma loses its fuel. The action may still happen conventionally. An enlightened being still walks, speaks, and interacts with the world, but because the underlying apprehension of inherent existence is gone, the action leaves no karmic residue. The mechanism of future becoming is dismantled.
The text uses an absolutely mind-bending analogy to illustrate this dynamic of empty causes producing empty effects. It asks us to imagine a magical apparition created by a Tathagata, a Buddha. This phantom is entirely an illusion. But then, that magical apparition uses magic to create another magical apparition.
A phantom creating a phantom.
It sounds absurd at first. A hologram projecting another hologram. Both of them are just names. They're significant only in their relative interaction. The first phantom can converse with the second phantom. They can have a phantom debate. They can engage in a phantom exchange of goods. To an outside observer caught in the illusion, a real event is occurring. But both entities are completely empty of any inherent reality.
And Nāgārjuna is telling us that this phantom creating a phantom scenario is a perfectly accurate, literal description of our own lives. We are the apparition created by empty causes and conditions, our previous karma, and through our current actions, which are fueled by empty intentions, we are constantly creating subsequent apparitions, our future states of mind, our future karmic results, our next rebirths.
We are holograms stressing out about the mortgages of the holograms we are projecting into the future.
That is the tragedy and, honestly, the comedy of samsara.
But this leads to a massive existential hurdle, which is the focus of the final movement of the text, verses 56 through 73. If our actions, our perceptions, our profoundest sufferings, and our greatest joys are all just apparitions creating apparitions, how does one actually live?
Yeah, that's the big question.
How do you operate within this phantom architecture without collapsing into extreme apathy? If it's all a dream, why not just lay down and do nothing?
That is the trap of nihilistic depression, and it is a very known risk on the Madhyamaka path. The final section of the Śūnyatāsaptati addresses liberation through wisdom and introduces the concept of the unsupported mind. It teaches us how to transcend the phantom cycle without resorting to apathy.
The text suggests that the karmic cycle is transcended with the wisdom of directly realizing the true nature of the 12 links, that union of the two truths. It is the realization that our defilements, our poisons, desire, hatred, delusion, are generated by empty discrimination between opposites.
Right. We suffer because our minds are obsessed with drawing lines. We discriminate between pleasant and unpleasant, between me and them, success and failure. We draw a solid black line on a map of an ocean current, and then we literally drown trying to build a house on that line.
But when we realize the line is just a conventional designation, the defilements lose their footing. Which brings us to the operational aspect of this wisdom. The text frames this as acting without acting, the union of the two truths in action.
It sounds paradoxical, almost like a Taoist concept, but in Madhyamaka, acting without acting has a highly specific, mechanical meaning. It means utilizing conventional truths, models, maps, and skillful means, what we call upāya, without ever apprehending any of those tools in absolute terms.
You pick up the hammer to build the house, but you never confuse the hammer for the absolute nature of reality.
You transcend samsara without rejecting samsara. You still feed your body, you still engage in relationships, you still work to alleviate the suffering of others, but you do it without the rigid, grasping reification that turns those actions into karmic chains. You act with immense conventional precision, understanding exactly how causes and conditions operate while maintaining complete ultimate freedom, knowing none of it inherently exists.
When you look at the world through this purified vision, the text suggests something incredibly profound. It states that everything is primordially equal and pure.
And purity here doesn't mean morally pristine or scrubbed clean of dirt. Purity means empty of inherent existence, because nothing has an inherent essence. Nothing is inherently dirty, inherently broken, or inherently evil. A lump of coal and a diamond are equally pure in their emptiness.
This fundamental equality completely reframes how we view the historical Buddha and his teachings. The theme of the Buddha's teaching without teaching. The Buddha spent 45 years walking across India, giving thousands of discourses, laying out monastic rules, describing intricate cosmologies and psychological states. He talked constantly.
Yet, from the perspective of the Śūnyatāsaptati, he never taught a single thing.
Not a single syllable of those thousands of discourses was an absolute truth.
Because if he had taught an absolute truth, he would have been teaching a falsehood. Because no absolute, inherently existent truth exists to be taught. Every single teaching, whether it sounded like realism, idealism, dualism, or monism, was just a provisional antidote. It was medicine.
The Buddha was a physician, treating the specific disease of the person sitting in front of him. If a student was paralyzed by nihilism, believing nothing mattered, the Buddha taught them the strict, unyielding mechanics of karma and rebirth. He gave them the medicine of realism.
But if a student was a rigid eternalist, clinging to the idea of a permanent, unchanging soul, the Buddha taught them impermanence, no self, and emptiness. He administered the antidote to their specific extreme position.
He used concepts to destroy concepts. He used words to dismantle the mind's reliance on words. The teachings are designed to transcend all conditioned, dualistic conceptual proliferation. They are designed to stop the mind from building absolute castles in the air.
And this brings us to the ultimate principle where Nāgārjuna leaves us at the end of these 70 verses. He leaves us in a state of profound, terrifying, and liberating groundlessness. He points us toward the Dharma that is lacking all supports.
The unsupported mind.
There is no absolute foundation. There is no bedrock. Not God, not the self, not the universe, not even emptiness itself. To find peace is to rely entirely on this unsupported mind. It is to abandon desire, delusion, and hatred, not by violently fighting them, but by deeply realizing their empty phantom nature. And you do this without destroying anything real, because there is nothing inherently real to destroy in the first place.
It is a breathtaking architecture. Just to pull back and look at the massive map we've sketched out today. We started by moving beyond simple dualities into the crucial unions, the union of the two truths, the union of the three spheres, the union of opposites. We explored the radical idea that ultimate and conventional truths are equal and mutually dependent, and that emptiness is just a tool, not the final reality.
And we examined how Nāgārjuna dismantled the mechanics of origination, duration, and cessation, proving that the verbs and processes we cling to are just as empty as the nouns we've already discarded. You are not a verb masquerading as a noun.
We saw how inherent existence is actually the enemy of change, a frozen universe, while emptiness is the architecture of possibility that allows karma and liberation to function. We walked through the phantom nature of karma apparitions, creating apparitions, and how the direct perception of the lucid dream shuts off the karmic engine.
And we arrived at the ultimate goal of acting without acting, living with an unsupported mind, and directly experiencing suchness, tathata, without trying to trap it in a conceptual cage.
And as a reminder to you listening, this was just the macro view. We mapped the forest today. The highly detailed verse-by-verse analysis of how Nāgārjuna mechanically executes these arguments in the Śūnyatāsaptati will follow in subsequent deep dives. So do not worry about missing the granular logical proofs today. We will get there.
The foundational blueprint is what matters first. Without it, you just get lost in the verses.
But for now, as we close, we want to leave you with a lingering thought. We've established that every teaching, every philosophy, every framework, including the very deep dive you just listened to, is ultimately an empty map. It is a provisional antidote meant to cure a specific delusion. The Buddhas teach without teaching. Every word is a medicine, meant to be discarded once the illness is cured.
Which means you have to examine the medicine you are currently taking.
If every teaching is a provisional cure, then what specific delusion, what specific intellectual rigidity is this exact conceptual framework curing in you right now? What are you holding on to so tightly that you needed Nāgārjuna to tear the ground out from under you? And perhaps most importantly, what will you do when you realize it's time to throw this map away?